can only trust Freud. That is obviously something that is very different from your typical way of doing science. It is much closer to pre-modern practice, such as alchemy.
Historian of science John Forrester thinks that this kind of critique of Freud is based on a mistaken and idealized understanding of how science works.
There is a fundamental confusion here and an idealization of the sciences in general. When the sciences in general talk about observation, they're talking about the senses, but there's always inference and interpretation involved in the sciences. For instance, when you talk about the chemical composition of the stars, you can never observe directly the elements in the stars. What you observe is the wavelengths of light which comes to the Earth from the stars. You never see a sodium atom. You have to infer sodium atoms, and it's a very complex and delicate conceptual procedure. Science, in some people's view, is at its best when it is at its most theoretical.
The evidential basis for Freud's work was, first of all, a lifetime of clinical observation. That's a lot of observation. So when you say, what is the evidential basis for Freud's conclusions, I think that it's vast. That's not to say that it's good evidence. I mean, the evidential basis for psychoanalysis is problematical, but that's in the nature of the subject that we're studying.
Dr. Mark Solms wears a double hat, the hard-edge one of neurology and experimental brain research, and the softer one of practicing analyst.
If you start from the starting point that Freud started from, which is that I want to study the world that lies behind inner perception, which is an entirely legitimate thing to study. I mean, it exists. There's no question that such a thing exists. If that's what you're wanting to study, your database is going to be subjective reports. Your own inner perception, which is the only thing you have direct access to with respect to the inner world, your own internal life, your own conscious awareness of your own internal life. And then with respect to other people, their verbal reports of their internal life. There's no way of getting around the subjectivity of the subject. So if you find that problematical, then there's nothing to discuss. Then you have to say subjectivity can't ever be something that gains scientific study. That would be an enormous loss to science.
It's quite clear that psychoanalysis is going to involve interpretation because the patient is saying things. The patient is talking language, and language requires interpretation for it to be understood. So that everything that Freud hears is going to be an interpretation. So if you want to give up, or if you want to get away from interpretation, you put earplugs in, and you never listen to a word the patient says.
I was in a strict Freudian analysis for a long time. My analyst died 2 years ago, and I never realized it.
Woody Allen obviously didn't get quite enough interpretation, though as his films make clear, he got plenty of Freud. Interestingly, Ian Hacking points out that our contemporary ideas of what constitutes science as science in part arise from what was initially a critique of Freud by the influential philosopher Karl Popper.
Karl Popper says that a proposition is scientific if it is capable of being tested and capable of being tested under circumstances which would refute it, and a scientist is a critical scientist if he accepts the results of critical tests. One of the reasons that Popper formulated this idea of testability as the criterion of science was specifically because he thought that psychoanalysis, along with historical Marxism, both of which presented themselves as sciences, were not testable or refutable in this way. By that criterion, I'm inclined to say that the fundamental propositions of psychoanalysis are not testable and hence not Popper scientific. But also, Popper insisted that that didn't mean that something was meaningless or not worth doing or was not on the road to becoming a science. Freud will be providing food for thought in my grandchildren's mature days, in my opinion.
But what if the illnesses which attack our inner, our mental processes, are chemically generated and not the result of the explanations Freud and psychoanalysis have given us about our lives? Another battle within the current Freud wars takes place in the field of brain chemistry. Historian of psychiatry, Edward Shorter.
My own dubiety about psychoanalysis emerged when I started to study the origins of psychopharmacology. One bears in mind that illnesses such as schizophrenia and depression were considered to be psychogenic, arising in the mind, that is, a result of stress or a result of false patterns of child rearing or a result of problems that the individual might be having in his social insertion, okay? These would all be ways in which the mind would be affected, which the mind would produce a mental illness. But these drugs like chlorpromazine affect the brain. And if by taking a pill you can abolish something like psychosis, then it's apparent that the origins of that psychosis couldn't possibly have been in stress or in false toilet training or whatever. They must be in the chemistry of the brain itself. And so that insight occurred to me just as it occurred to many other people as they pondered the rise of psychopharmacology. The axis began to shift very massively. If our patients are having mental problems, it's not because there's a problem with their minds, it's because there's a problem with their brains.
John Forrester treats this kind of argument with a measure of skepticism.
The problem is that because your treatment has an effect, you're tempted to infer that something of the same order was the cause. So you think because chlorpromazine has an effect on schizophrenia, you can see the causality of schizophrenia, not in early childhood, but in an imbalance of chemicals in the brain. Now, that's the same mistake as if we had a television that didn't work, and we banged it, and it started working, and we then inferred that the original malfunction in the television came from a lack of banging.
Banging the television or taking a pill may have their immediate uses, even if they don't tell us a great deal about how we become who we are and sometimes fall ill of it. Yet recent research of the kind we classify as science without needing to think about the term's meanings seems to shore up two aspects of psychoanalysis. The first is that there is visible physical evidence that talking treatments affect and alter the same part of the brain, and in the same way, as certain psychotropic drugs.